In the history of human thought, few movements have left such a profound and lasting mark as Renaissance humanism. Originating in Italy in the 14th century and spreading throughout Europe for the next 2 centuries, this movement was not merely a preschool or literary movement, but a comprehensive intellectual revolution, a revolution that placed humanity at the center of the universe of knowledge, establishing the theistic conception that dominated throughout the Middle Ages. To understand the true meaning of Renaissance humanism, we need to consider it from multiple perspectives: its historical context, its core ideological foundations, its representative figures, its influence on art and science, and the modern legacy it left for the world. To understand why Renaissance humanism emerged, one must first look back at the intellectual and social order it was responding to. The Middle Ages, approximately the 5th to 14th centuries, were an era in which Christian theology controlled almost every field of knowledge. The Roman Catholic Church was not only the supreme religious power, but also the cultural, educational, and political institution. Scholastic philosophy, especially the theological synthesis of Thomas Aquinas, placed reason in a subservient position to faith, taking biblical texts and patristic texts as the absolute measure of truth. In medieval conceptions, man was a creature burdened by original sin. Earthly life was merely a temporary journey towards eternity. The body and desires were viewed with suspicion, even contempt. Secular knowledge, science, art, literature was only valuable when serving religious purposes. This was the foundation upon which Renaissance humanism would overthrow and rebuild. It is no coincidence that Renaissance humanism began in Italy, specifically in wealthy city-states such as Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan. 14th century, Italy possessed exceptionally favorable conditions. Commercial prosperity. The Italian city-states were the commercial centers of Europe, connecting with the Islamic and Eastern world via the Silk Road. This wealth created a class of citizens and merchants capable of patronizing the arts and scholarship, something feudal Europe lacked. Ancient Roman heritage. Italy was the land of the Roman Empire. Throughout Italy, the remnants of ancient civilization were tangible, from the Colosseum to architectural structures, from sculptures to ancient Latin manuscripts. Renaissance Italians felt themselves to be direct descendants of the Great Rome, and this fueled a desire for revival. The fall of Constantinople, 1453. With the fall of the Byzantine Empire, a wave of Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing with them countless manuscripts of ancient Greek literature, philosophy, and science. This vast source of knowledge rekindled the Italians' already fervent fascination with Greco-Roman civilization. The art patronage system. Powerful families like the Medici in Florence were not only politicians, but also ardent patrons of scholarship and the arts. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, established the Platonic Academy, gathering the greatest talents of the era around him. The central slogan of Renaissance humanism was ad fontes, Latin for return to the source. This was not merely nostalgia but a revolutionary methodology. Instead of acquiring knowledge through distorted medieval commentary and interpretation, one should return to reading directly the original texts of Cicero, Virgil, Plato, Aristotle, and other ancient authors. This had profound implications. When humanists read Cicero in its original Latin, they discovered a completely different way of thinking. Philosophy was not for defending faith but for discovering virtue and the art of living well. In classical thought, the human being was a creature of inherent dignity, capable of reason and creativity, and able to participate in political and community life. Lorenzo Valla 1407–1457 is one of the most striking examples of the ad fontes spirit. Through rigorous linguistic analysis, he demonstrated that the letter to Constantine, the document the Pope relied on to assert his secular authority, was a forgery from the 8th century, not from the time of Emperor Constantine of the 4th century. This was a direct attack on the authority of the Church using academic methods. If there is one text that most concisely embodies the spirit of Renaissance humanism, it is Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's 1463–1494 speech entitled Oratio de Homines Dignitate, Speech on the Dignity of Man, 1486. In this work, Pico constructs a particularly striking image of the place of man in nature. According to Pico, after creating the world with all its creatures, from the angels above to the animals below, God realized there was no longer a mold to create man. Therefore, he bestowed upon man a special gift, the ability to define himself. Unlike other creatures bound by instinct and fixed positions in the natural order, man could choose to humble himself like an animal or rise to the level of an angel. This idea was revolutionary compared to medieval theology, which emphasized the sinful and weak nature of humanity. Pico, instead, affirmed human free will, creativity, and unlimited potential for self-improvement. Humans were no longer passive creatures, but architects of their own destiny. Renaissance humanism was not merely an abstract philosophy, but a concrete educational program. Studia Humanitatis, that is, the studies of humanity comprising 5 fields: grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. This was a conscious contrast to the scholastic theological curriculum of medieval universities, which focused on logic, metaphysics, and theology. The goal of humanistic education was not to produce theologians or monks, but to train well-rounded citizens, uomo universal, universal man. This ideal demanded proficiency not only in theoretical knowledge but also in practical skills: oratorical ability, political participation, poetry writing, musical instrument playing, and mastery of physical and social skills. One of the most important intellectual contributions of Renaissance humanism was the reevaluation of the active life, vita activa, versus the contemplative life, vita contemplativa. Medieval traditions celebrated asceticism, prayer, and meditation as the pinnacle of human perfection. Renaissance humanists, especially those following the civic humanism trend, reversed this hierarchy. Lucio Salutati, 1331–1406, and Leonardo Bruni, 1369–1444, both secretaries of the Republic of Florence, argued that active participation in political and social life was the highest form of human existence. Virtue was not achieved by withdrawing from the world, but by participating in it, serving the community, and fulfilling civic responsibilities. Francesco Petrarch, 1304–1374, is often called the father of humanism. He was the first to clearly articulate the idea of dark ages, separating his era from the glory of ancient Rome, and the first to propose a systematic program for the restoration of ancient culture. Petrarch was passionate about collecting and studying ancient Latin manuscripts, especially the works of Cicero. When he discovered Cicero's letters in the Verona Library in 1345, he was delighted not only by their academic value, but also by the fact that they revealed a completely different Cicero, not the abstract rhetorician, but a vibrant human being with the anxieties, ambitions, and torments of everyday life. Petrarch's poetry, especially Canzoniere, written about his love for Laura, is a magnificent blend of classical spirit and modern personal sensitivity. He wrote in colloquial Italian vulgare, rather than the academic Latin, creating a literary tradition more accessible to a wider audience. At the same time, he also wrote in pure Latin in the style of Cicero, establishing a model of prose that future generations would emulate. Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1466–1536, was perhaps the most important figure of Northern humanism. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Erasmus was a Catholic priest, but also the most scathing critic of the Church's decay. His work Morii Encomium, A Hymn to Madness, 1511, is a satirical masterpiece in which the madman praises himself, and in doing so exposes the stupidity of all social classes, from clergy to nobility, from scholars to merchants. But behind the humorous facade lies a serious message about the need for social and ecclesiastical reform. Erasmus's most important academic contribution was his Greek New Testament revision, 1516, the greatest ad fontes work in the field of religion. By comparing the oldest Greek manuscripts, he demonstrated that the Latin Vulgate translation, the official translation of the Church, contained numerous significant translation errors. This was not only an academic discovery, but also a direct challenge to the authority of the Church. Thomas More, 1478–1535, a close friend of Erasmus, represented another dimension of Renaissance humanism, the combination of humanist ideals with social critique. His work, Utopia, 1516, depicts an imaginary island nation where property is collectively owned, war is hated, and all citizens receive a full education. Utopia is not a serious social blueprint, but rather an intellectual experiment, a way to critique contemporary European society by juxtaposing it with a hypothetical ideal society. Through this comparison, More exposes the absurdity of the private property system, the brutality of glorious wars, and the hypocrisy of European aristocratic values. Michel de Montaigne, 1533–1592, introduced humanism to a whole new dimension, self-discovery. In the Essays, the prose genre he himself invented, Montaigne takes himself as the object of study and reflection. Quesisgi, what do I know? Montaigne's famous question expresses a spirit of constructive skepticism, not a denial of all knowledge, but a recognition of the limitations of human knowledge and the need to maintain a humble and open attitude. He recognizes that he himself, and thus human nature in general, is complex, contradictory, and cannot be reduced to any simple formula. One of the most evident manifestations of Renaissance humanism in art was the return to the depiction of the human body. Medieval art often avoided the materiality of the body. Figures were depicted flat, symbolic, and dematerialized to emphasize spirituality. Renaissance art, on the contrary, celebrated the human body as the highest masterpiece of divine creation. Michelangelo 1475–1564 was the one who best embodied this idea. His work David 1504, a statue of a naked young man preparing to face Goliath, is not only a technically brilliant work of sculpture, but also a declaration of human dignity. In this work, man is not a sinful creature in need of redemption, but a beautiful, powerful, and capable being, the measure of all things, in the language of ancient philosophy. Filippo Brunelleschi's invention of linear perspective in the early 15th century was one of the most important technical contributions of the Renaissance, but its significance extends far beyond purely technical aspects. Linear perspective places the viewer's eye at the center of the visual system. The entire space in the painting is organized around the point of view of a human observer. This is a philosophical shift. Space is no longer organized according to theological logic, with God above, man below, but according to human perceptual logic. Man becomes the center of measurement and organization of reality, directly reflecting the humanist idea that man is the measure of all things. The development of the portrait genre during the Renaissance also carried profound humanistic significance. In the Middle Ages, individuals were typically only depicted when they played religious roles, saints, philanthropists, and were often idealized rather than realistically portrayed. The Renaissance created a new tradition, portraiture as a record of the unique personality of a particular person, their face, expressions, and character. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa is the most famous example of this trend. But more important than this particular painting is the entire portraiture tradition that the Renaissance created, an affirmation that each individual, with their unique characteristics and personality, deserves to be recorded and remembered. Renaissance humanism did not directly create the scientific revolution, but it provided the intellectual ground necessary for it. Most importantly, it established the spirit of direct observation and experimental research instead of relying solely on textual authority. Leonardo da Vinci, 1452–1519, was the perfect embodiment of the ideal of uomo universale. His diaries contain thousands of technical, anatomical, hydrological, mechanical, and astronomical sketches, all stemming from direct observation and empirical thinking. He practiced real human anatomy, forbidden by the Church, but which he did in secret, to understand the human body from the inside, not through Galen's textual descriptions. Nicolaus Copernicus, 1473–1543, the proponent of the heliocentric model in his work De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, 1543, was not a direct product of humanism, but his intellectual revolution took place within the atmosphere that humanism had created. The spirit of willingness to challenge traditional authority, including the authority of Aristotle and Ptolemy, which the Middle Ages considered absolute, is a direct legacy of humanism. More importantly, when Copernicus placed the sun at the center and pushed the earth to the periphery, he did something paradoxical. Although astronomically, man was no longer at the center of the universe, epistemologically, man, with his reason and observational abilities, became more powerful than ever. Man does not need a physical central position to assert his dignity. Instead, it is the ability to understand and interpret the universe that is proof of that dignity. The relationship between Renaissance humanism and Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation was complex and sometimes contradictory. On the one hand, humanism, with its ad fontes spirit and critique of the Church's decadence, prepared the intellectual ground for the Reformation. Erasmus's Greek translation of the New Testament provided Luther and others with scholarly evidence of the inaccuracies in the Vulgate and Orthodox Catholic theology. However, when the Reformation truly broke out after 1517, many humanists, including Erasmus, chose to remain with the Catholic Church. They wanted reform from within, not to break the unity of European Christianity. Erasmus famously argued fiercely with Luther about free will, a debate that exposed the deep differences between the humanist and Protestant spirit. Many Renaissance humanists did not abandon their Christian faith. Instead, they attempted to combine classical heritage with Christian theology in a new way. This is what later scholars called Christian humanism. Erasmus is the most prominent example. He believed that studying ancient languages and literature not only did not conflict with faith, but also helped to understand the message of the gospel more accurately and profoundly. He dreamed of a Philosophia Christi, a simple form of Christianity based on love and practical virtue, unburdened by the endless abstract theological debates of the Middle Ages. The legacy of Renaissance humanism on the modern world is so profound and extensive that it is difficult to overstate. Most of what we take for granted in modern culture, respect for the individual, the ideal of holistic education, the independence of reason from dogma, the value of art and literature in human life, are at least partly derived from the Renaissance intellectual revolution. The modern concept of human rights, that every human being, simply for being human, possesses certain inalienable rights, is a further development of the Renaissance conception of human dignity. When Pico della Mirandola spoke of the infinite potential of humanity, he laid the philosophical foundation for the concept of the intrinsic value of each individual. The liberal education model, which remains the foundation of many Western higher education systems, is a direct legacy of Renaissance Studia Humanitatis. The ideal that a good education not only trains professional skills, but also develops the whole person, capable of critical thinking, effective communication, and responsible participation in democratic life, is a Renaissance ideal that has been transformed into modern times. The constructive skepticism that Montaigne represented, a humble understanding, a willingness to consider multiple perspectives, never assuming one's own understanding to be complete and definitive, is one of humanism's most valuable contributions to modern thought. In an age of absolute convictions and extremism, Montaigne's quasi, what do I say, spirit remains just as relevant. However, a fair analysis of Renaissance humanism must also acknowledge its limitations and contradictions. The human being in the Renaissance humanist conception was largely male, belonging to the upper class and European. Women, peasants, black people, indigenous peoples in the lands being conquered by Europe, all were outside this circle of humanism. The reality is that the 15th and 16th centuries, the period when humanism flourished in Europe, was also a period of brutal colonial conquest in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Theories of human dignity did not apply to the massacred Native Americans or the enslaved Africans. This is a profound historical contradiction that we cannot ignore when evaluating the Renaissance legacy. Furthermore, humanism, in its celebration of human capabilities, sometimes carries a seed of arrogance. The notion that humans have the right and ability to control, exploit, and transform nature at will. In the context of the current environmental crisis, this legacy is being seriously re-examined. Renaissance humanism is one of the most important intellectual movements in human history. It brought about a profound intellectual revolution, placing humanity, with reason, dignity, and creativity, at the center of the worldview, replacing medieval theocracy. It created immense legacies, from the enduring art of the Renaissance to modern liberal education, from the spirit of empirical science to the ideals of democracy and human rights. However, this legacy is not the end of a journey but the beginning of an unfinished project. The core questions posed by Renaissance humanism, what is man? What can man become? How can man live well and contribute to the community? Remain highly relevant. In the 21st century, with unprecedented challenges from artificial intelligence, climate change, and global inequality, these questions need to be asked and answered with a truly humanistic spirit, a spirit that is more inclusive, humble, and responsible than the original Renaissance version. The Renaissance teaches us that great intellectual revolutions often begin with a simple yet profound question, and one that is courageous enough to ask. Petrarch's question was, why can't we restore the beauty and wisdom of the ancient world? Perhaps the question of the 21st century is, how do we build a world in which every human being, regardless of gender, race, culture, or background, is truly recognized as having dignity and the potential to thrive? The answer to that question will be the next step in the humanist project that the Renaissance began.